Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking an event that honestly sounds like the setup to a bizarre historical comedy, but was actually a high-stakes geopolitical thriller, the Pig War of 1859. I want you to picture the intense, nail-biting tension of a Cold War standoff. We're talking two global superpowers hovering with their fingers right over the trigger. But instead of nuclear codes, right at the very center of this international crisis sits a farm animal. Exactly one. That is the total number of casualties in this massive, multi-year military standoff between the United States and Great Britain. Despite the presence of thousands of heavily armed men, warships, and cannons, the only blood spilled during this entire international incident belonged to a single stray pig. Okay, let's dive into this. You've got to be wondering, how on earth does a mundane incident involving a hungry farm animal snowball into a crisis that nearly brought two of the most powerful nations on Earth to the brink of total war? Well, to understand how we get from a garden pest to a literal naval blockade, we have to start with the inciting incident. Section 1, the one pig casualty, our micro-inciting incident. So picture this. The date is June 15th, 1859. We're on San Juan Island. American farmer Lyman Cutler walks outside to find a massive black Berkshire pig absolutely destroying his prized potatoes. Frustrated by this repeat trespasser, Cutler shoots the pig dead. Well, this immediately creates a volatile dispute with a man named Charles Griffin. He was an Irishman employed by the British Hudson's Bay Company, and crucially, he was the pig's rightful owner. So suddenly, you have two men from two completely different nations representing two entirely different claims to the land colliding head-on over a dead pig. So the crucial point is how this petty financial dispute became the spark that lit the powder keg. Cutler, acknowledging he shot the pig, offered Griffin $10 in compensation. Griffin, however, was furious. He demanded a staggering $100. And let me tell you, that was a massive, exorbitant sum of money back in 1859. Cutler absolutely refused to pay that inflated price. And this is right where things spiraled. Because Cutler wouldn't pay, British authorities stepped in and threatened to arrest the American farmer. In response to this threat from a foreign power, the American settlers on the island panicked and officially called for United States military protection. Section 2, a vague border treaty. Because to understand this micro-dispute, we really have to zoom out and look at the macro geopolitics. You see, the real villain of this story isn't the pig, it's bad paperwork. 13 years earlier, the 1846 Treaty of Oregon was signed to establish the border between the U.S. and British North America right at the 49th parallel. The treaty stated that the border would extend westward along this line until it reached the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island, and then it would head south through the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the Pacific. Now, it sounds definitive on paper, right? But as we know, geography doesn't always cooperate with ink. And this brilliantly illustrates the problem. Because the treaty just vaguely said middle of the channel, both sides interpreted it to their own advantage. The San Juan Islands sat smack dab in the middle of this poorly defined area bordered by two major navigable waterways. The British claimed the border ran through the Rosario Strait to the east, meaning the islands belonged to them. The Americans? Well, they claimed the border ran through the Haro Strait to the west, meaning the islands were U.S. territory. So both nations had legally convinced themselves they owned the exact same patch of dirt. And this wasn't just about civic pride. No, this was about global commerce and military supremacy. Whoever held the San Juan Islands completely controlled the primary shipping lanes in the region, leading out to the Pacific Ocean. This was absolutely critical maritime territory. That's exactly why both American settlers and British Hudson's Bay Company employees had set up camps there in the first place. The pig? The pig was just a match dropped into a room already filled with gasoline. Section 3. The Great Pig Escalation and the Standoff at San Juan. Once that call for military help went out, the tension just blew wide open in a rapid, aggressive tit-for-tat. Step 1, the U.S. military dispatches Captain George Pickett. And yes, that is the exact same Pickett who would later lead the infamous charge at Gettysburg. He arrives with 66 soldiers, lands on San Juan Island, and aggressively declares it United States territory. Step 2, Great Britain absolutely cannot let this stand. They immediately dispatch Captain Geoffrey Hornby. And they don't just send a small garrison. They send 3 heavily armed British warships. The posturing had officially become a fully militarized standoff. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer, staggering scale of the escalation. It's honestly hard to believe. By August 1859, the United States had ramped up their presence to 461 soldiers and 14 cannons. Great Britain flexed their naval dominance, bringing their presence to 5 warships, 167 guns, and over 2,100 men. Just let those numbers sink in for a second. Thousands of soldiers, over 180 pieces of heavy artillery, warships anchored off the coast, all facing each other down, fully prepared to slaughter one another because a farmer named Lyman didn't want to pay $100 for an Irishman's pig. The absurdity was matched only by the deadly reality of the situation. But then, we get a dramatic record scratch. Right as the tension is at its absolute peak, British Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines arrives on the scene. And instead of giving the order to fire, he looks at the situation, completely disobeys the momentum of war, and issues a strict stand-down order to his commanders. His rationale is captured perfectly in this famous quote. He said it would be foolish to involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. With one sentence of absolute, clear-eyed sanity, Baines stopped a global conflict dead in its tracks. Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds into a peaceful resolution where sanity finally prevails. Imagine the reaction when politicians in Washington, D.C. and London finally heard about this. They were utterly horrified at how close they had just come to an all-out war over a farm animal. This initiated an incredible timeline of de-escalation. In 1859, both governments quickly agreed to a joint military occupation while they sorted out the border diplomatically. And this led to a fascinating period from 1859 to 1871, where a small British Royal Marine camp sat on the north end of the island and an American camp sat on the south. Finally, in 1872, the dispute was completely resolved. But I really want to focus on that middle period, 12 years. For 12 whole years, these 2 military garrisons, who, remember, had just been staring down the barrels of each other's cannons, lived in total peace on the same small island. In fact, it was bizarrely wholesome. The English camp and the American camp became famously friendly. They regularly hosted each other for dinners, celebrated each other's national holidays together, and even held joint athletic competitions. It really is one of the most heartwarming twists in military history. The final resolution came through international diplomacy. In 1872, both nations agreed to let Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany act as a neutral third-party arbitrator. A 3-man commission reviewed the vague wording of that old 1846 treaty, studied all the maps, and ultimately ruled in favor of the United States. The official maritime boundary was firmly placed through the Haro Strait, and the San Juan Islands were securely and peacefully handed over to U.S. territory. Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder. The pig war is a fantastic story, sure, but it's also a stark warning. What happens when vague diplomacy meets everyday stubbornness? Well, we saw it firsthand. A destroyed potato patch almost sparked a catastrophic global war. This explainer shows us just how quickly human ego can escalate a situation totally beyond all logic. It really makes you wonder, if Admiral Baines hadn't possessed the courage to be the voice of reason and stop that escalation, how vastly different would our history books look today? It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the fate of nations rests on a knife's edge, or, in this case, on the appetite of one very unlucky pig. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today.